Good afternoon. It's Wednesday, the 19th of February, 2025, just after 1 o'clock. Welcome to UK Culling News. I'm your host, Mike Robinson. Joining me today in the studio is Charles Malet, and by video link, we have Vanessa, Beeley and Sandi Adams. Welcome to the programme, everyone.
Thanks,
and we are going to begin with, war, of course, because the Secretary of State for War, John Healey, delivered a speech at the Institute for Government yesterday to announce the biggest defence shake-up in 50 years. So we should all be happy about that. And this is to make sure the UK is war ready. And the biggest of the biggest announcements was perhaps the complete concentration of wartime power into the hands of 4 incompetents, led by Admiral Radican, Chief of the Defence Staff. It has to be said that our Secretary of State for War's delivery should be bottled as a cure for insomnia, but nonetheless, if we can bear it, let's have a listen to a little of what he had to say.
So today I'm here to declare that investment in defence will be matched by reform. First, we're introducing clear points of accountability at every level within UK defence, starting at the top with 4 new senior leaders. 4 leaders who report to me as Defence Secretary and my ministerial team at the central point of accountability to the British people and to the British Parliament. The Chief of the Defence Staff, who for the first time since this role was created, now commands the service chiefs, who will be the head of a newly established military strategic headquarters responsible for force design and war planning across our integrated force. The Permanent Secretary, our Principal Accounting Officer, who will run a leaner, more agile Department of State, with more policy muscle to lead arguments across Whitehall and with allies. We'll revamp the senior roles to elevate those into policymakers with broad portfolios and powerful mandates. Third, our new armaments director, who will fix procurement and drive growth, and I'll come back to the detail of the National Armaments Director in a moment. And fourthly, our Chief of Defence Nuclear, who will continue to lead and deliver the national nuclear enterprise within the recently established ring fence and freedoms. This new quad will lead a defence which is more concentrated on warfighting readiness and on deterrence. And this new quad will be up and running from the 31st of March.
So what do you make of that, Charles?
Well, he sounds rather like a packet of those fridge magnets where you're confined to being able to use only the same words regardless of what speech you're delivering. But I think on certainly the earlier bit, readiness to war, I think there's a sort of willful straying away from the more important issue, which is not necessarily readiness for war, because it would be easy to declare that you might consider yourselves to be ready. It's far more apposite, really, to be considering whether or not war is appropriate, sensible, or in any way going to improve anybody's life. And the answer to all of those, I think, would have to be no.
Absolutely. Now, he was then, later in the speech, discussing the need to rearm. Let's have a listen.
So sitting alongside the Permanent Secretary and the Chief of Defence Staff, they'll execute a £20 billion plus budget to build and sustain our national arms arsenal. Because at this time, we must rearm Britain. And I see this as a new FTSE 100 company within the MOD, tasked, if you like, with getting the very best capabilities needed into the hands of our frontline forces, delivering on our defence industrial strategy to create more defence jobs, more defence apprenticeships in every region and nation across the UK.
Now, of course, he was completely silent about why we have to rearm Britain, and having spent our entire of our arsenal on helping Russia train what is possibly now the most effective fighting force in the world. I don't know if you agree with that, but I mean, we have effectively trained the Russian military in a way that we haven't trained the Ukrainians, because actually do we have anybody, Charles, in the military at the moment that has the experience to properly train the Ukrainians?
That has what, sorry?
Proper experience of this type of
Oh, I
operation.
see. We shouldn't do.
No, indeed. So anyway, but what's clear is that we're now officially, apparently, on a war footing. We need to make sure more people's lives and livelihoods are reliant on that war footing in order to maintain public support for the war policy. But maybe I'm just being too cynical about that. But this all follows the Paris get-together as European leaders are flailing around trying to work out what to do about Trump, and Keir Starmer's article in the Telegraph here, where he declared his intention to send British troops to Ukraine openly for the first time. So he said, first, Europe must step up further to meet demands of its own security. So this is what Brian was talking about on Monday. It's what we've been talking about for many, many years. But he went on to say, so I'm heading to Paris with a very clear message for our European friends. We've got to show we are truly serious about our own defence and bearing our own burden. We've talked about it for too long, and President Trump is right to demand that we get on with it. So, as I say, Brian reminded us of this on Monday. It's a long-standing policy objective. It's one which successive British regimes have been encouraging alongside the European Commission and NATO, but which many EU member states have been pushing back on as hard as they can because it represents perhaps a step too far for their own national sovereignty. The question is if the Trump effect can push it over the line, and that remains to be seen. But anyway, Starmer went on to say, we did mention this, bearing our own burden. So anyway, it is interesting that getting back to UK boots on the ground for a second, what would the role be? And perhaps we get a hint from this article, which is about a speech given almost exactly a year ago. Ambassador James Kariuki giving a speech to the Special Committee on Peacekeeping Operations, and the speech entitled "Peacekeeping is one of the UN's most valuable tools to support global peace and security." But by coincidence, this was just published yesterday, and I'm not clear why it was published yesterday, so I'm maybe adding 2 and 2 together and getting 5, but it seems that the timing of that particular speech is indicative of what we might be viewing our role to be in Ukraine. But in parallel with the EU gathering, of course, the United States and Russia met for their peace talks in Riyadh yesterday. In response to a question from Russian television about the impression that he got of the Americans, Sergei Lavrov said, we engaged in good, positive negotiations. The atmosphere was exceedingly positive. A positive atmosphere is cultivated by positive individuals. So it was all very positive, apparently. But the question is, how would the Russians view Starmer's deployment of British troops as a peacekeeping force? Let's have a listen to what Lavrov had to say.
The Americans would like to see what countries are ready to provide troops. And today, at today's meeting, we explained and said that we noted very well that President Trump, in several of his speeches, the first among Western leaders, had said many times that drawing Ukraine into NATO is one of the main reasons of what is happening, that it's one of Biden's biggest mistakes. And had Trump been president back then, he wouldn't have let that happen. In this connection, we explained to our counterparts that President Putin had many times underscored that NATO expansion and Ukraine's entrance is a direct threat to the interests of the Russian Federation, a direct threat to our sovereignty. And for that reason, we said today, deployment of armed troops from NATO countries under any different flag, under an EU flag or under national flags, doesn't change anything. It's unacceptable to us.
So that's pretty clear. But in the meantime, legacy media has been going nuts over all this chaos. Their world is falling apart, apparently, but they are finally acknowledging something which Patrick mentioned a couple of weeks ago, that Zelensky is perhaps for the chop. So here's the BBC. Zelensky could fall as price of peace as US and Russia agree more talks. The question is, Is it London for him, or is that one immigrant too far for the British people? That remains to be seen. But I don't know what your thoughts are on that, Charles.
Well, I mean, maybe not specifically on that, but I think the issue of peacekeeping is something that seems that, I mean, obviously anything Keir Starmer said is without qualification, because he has no practical experience of this. He's supported by a chief of defence staff who has very little operational experience and doesn't understand war fighting. The issue on peacekeeping is whether or not it has the support of the home nation. So has Zelensky actually invited Starmer to make such a proposal, and if not, that's a problem. But if this is not to be done under a NATO banner, then that's exactly where Ukraine and Zelensky might take issue, because it would suggest that membership of NATO is in fact still a distant prospect, which is not what they want. But of course, it does still enable the UK, the United States, everybody else to continue to use Ukraine as a proxy should they so choose. So in effect, this would give the United States and the United Kingdom and anybody else that wants to join in the ability to have a sort of controlling oversight over the very lucrative business of reconstructing, in enormous inverted commas, Ukraine.
Thank you, Charles. Vanessa, let me welcome you to the programme. If you want to comment on any of this, please do. But then come on to what is the Abraham Shield?
Yes, I'll probably keep to extra because I'm so flabbergasted by Britain's. I don't know what to call it anymore. I mean, it's just idiocy. But anyway, let's come on to the madness that's ongoing in this region. And this is something that I wanted to draw people's attention to, because at UK Culling, we've been talking for a long time about what the direction of travel is, what the end game is, and this lays it out very nicely. This is a newly formed, since October the 7th, the Coalition for Regional Security. And basically, this was established about a year after October the 7th, and represents a wide and diverse group of public figures and opinion leaders in the security, diplomacy, business, high-tech and research field who joined together to ensure the security of the State of Israel through the promotion of the Abraham Shield Plan. And of course, we know that that's an extension of the Abraham Accords that were established by Trump's son-in-law, Jared Kushner, back under Trump's first administration. And then just looking through at the About Us section, with crisis comes opportunity, a new regional order in the Middle East. And of course, this is the new Middle East that has been spoken about for decades, even going back to the Clean Break Doctrine in 1997. But I really, this document is quite shocking in how clearly it lays out the plans of the Abraham Alliance, which of course we'll come on to, but is headed by the US and Israel. And clearly Trump has been brought in to carry this plan through. So the State of Israel has been dealing with 7 different fronts that form the Iranian, of course. No one else has any problem with the State of Israel in the region at all. The Iranian Ring of Fire that seeks to destroy Israel. And then moving on, we have also the new regional order. And this is why Iran turned Gaza into Hamas, southern Lebanon into Hezbollah-stan, built militias in Iraq and Syria, and strengthened the Houthis, aka Ansarullah, in Yemen. It is why Iran is trying to infiltrate Jordan, the West Bank, and Egypt. And I've paraphrased a little bit there, while at the same time implementing its nuclear program. So this is the nub of the matter. Of course, it's always been the biggest problem for Israel that Iran may develop some kind of nuclear capability, while of course Israel has clandestinely been producing its own nuclear capability for decades without the knowledge even of the United States. So if we actually go through the plan itself, as I said, it lays it out very clearly. This is part 1, those 6 steps to the plan. Closing the front in Gaza, which is very much what we said when Trump was elected, when the so-called ceasefire was brought in. It was very clear that that was the closing of this file and the pivot to the next stage, returning all hostages, establishing a technocratic transitional government in Gaza, and a regionally led de-Hamasification try and say that quickly. And you're getting the idea of the actual lexicon used in this plan, which for me is absolutely disgusting. It's reducing the Palestinians, the political national identity of the Palestinians down to these derogatory terms. And so part one, again, closing the front in Gaza, returning all hostages. Arab police forces, Western reconstruction package. So it's harnessing the normalized Arab states under the Abraham Accords to police Gaza and have military presence in Gaza, and the US and the West to actually rebuild Gaza. And of course, we know that the vision for that is this free trade zone, this kind of Dubaiification of Gaza and of Palestine, and the theft of Palestinian gas. This has already pretty much been approved by the UAE. The envoy to Washington claims no alternative to ethnic cleansing of Gaza. So he's already put his stamp on the Trump Take Gaza plan. But Saudi Arabia is also sort of a little bit coming forward now. About a year ago, even while Palestinians were being genocided by the Zionists, the Saudi Crown Prince said publicly that he personally doesn't care about the Palestinian issue. And back in, I think it was 2023, so 1 year before that, on the September the 11th, 2023, he publicly stated, "This is Saudi's war. This is my war. I am not going to die until I see the Middle East at the forefront of the world." So the battle lines are being very clearly drawn. And within this document, that is made even clearer to a large extent. Now, this is fascinating. We've been talking about the correlation between what the Israelis have been doing to the Palestinians for years and what has been happening in the West with CBDC, central digital surveillance, and so on. And guess what? It's actually now included in the Abraham Shield, still under the section of 01. Cash in the Gaza Strip will be abolished. Zero cash. So we don't even have kind of zero everything else. We now have zero cash. And an advanced mechanism of monetary supervision will be implemented. So you can guess what that is. If you're not going to submit to occupation, if you're not going to accept Israeli oppression, if you're not going to accept living in a concentration camp reduced even further down from what Gaza already is, then you won't receive any cash. That's basically the bottom line there. And then I think if we move on to the second section, implementing and enforcing the agreement in southern Lebanon. So Lebanon then is getting pulled into this entire plan through a zero violation. Now, since the ceasefire that came into effect on the 26th of January, Israel has violated that more than 1,400 times, 1,400 times. And actually, since they agreed to some degree to withdraw from Lebanon on the 18th, they've already today assassinated a mayor of one of the villages in the south on the border with Israel, targeting his car with a drone. So if we're talking about zero violations, and very important, strengthening the Lebanese army. So this becomes very clear that where the Lebanese army has been pulled in to replace Hezbollah in the south of Lebanon, now Israel is clearly saying Israel is going to be strengthening the Lebanese army. So what does this mean? The Lebanese army becomes a proxy of Israel in Lebanese territory on the border and occupying the border towns of the southern Lebanese people, right? And because it's not only Hezbollah who live in the south, there are Christians, there are Sunnis, there are multiple sects and faiths down in southern Lebanon also. And remember that the US has already been sponsoring the Lebanese army in order to keep it absolutely toothless and unable to respond to Israel anyway. 03, part of the Shield plan, following the fall of the Assad regime, harnessing regional forces to stabilize Syria and turn it into a buffer against the Iranian axis. So this becomes clear now why Syria it was absolutely essential that Syria should fall. It also talks about continued occupation of the Golan territories, but that, of course, also means the territory in southern Syria that it now has annexed, and it is busy building military posts, increased now up to more than 9. It will prevent the arms coming into Lebanon to the resistance if they want to defend themselves against the Israeli violations of any ceasefire agreement. And they're going to enlist, this is the actual wording of the document, US administration to prevent Iran regaining a presence inside Syria. And they will work with Turkey, which they consider to be central to keeping order. And of course, that has been in place since 1993 with the security accord between Turkey and Israel, where they can use their Turkish territory to spy on the regional countries. And then if we move on to 04, which is basically to expand and deepen moderate regional coalition, that's what I was talking about, the Gulf states, the Sunni Islamic states predominantly, that are very much, of course, under the control of the US and the British, returning to a fast-track normalization with Saudi Arabia and expanding the Abraham Accords. So what does this mean? Of course, it means Greater Israel. It means Israel is going to expand through its alliances and collaboration and entrapment of those Gulf states and other states like Jordan, for example, who are already, and Egypt, who are very much under the control of the West and Israel. And 05, which is basically the blockade plan, as they call it, implementing a blockade plan against Iran and preventing its nuclearization. So again, we're back to the hub of the issue. And then moving on to, this is where the wording just becomes extraordinary. The last section of the document, an Israeli declaration of gradual, responsible, secure path of separation from the Palestinians within a decade. So gone is the two-state solution. That doesn't even exist in this document. One-state solution is in the bin. Two-state solution is gone. And instead, you have part of a comprehensive regional agreement to basically squeeze the Palestinians out and to give Israel supremacy in the region. And then moving on again, we have again, back on the separation issue. So they say with the implementation of reforms and the fulfillment of the conditions of separation, the Palestinians will join the Abraham Alliance. So basically, when they've been indoctrinated, when they've been forced out of any form of resistance and basically declawed from a Palestinian political identity or even a national identity, freedom for Israel to bomb whenever they feel that there is any kind of infraction, a complete demilitarization, they'll be allowed to join the Abraham Alliance, which will prevent the infiltration of Iranian influence on Israel's borders. Not Hamastan, rather Abrahamistan. I mean, this is a very chilling document. Of course, the resistance are not going to allow this to happen. The Yemenis have already come out publicly to say that if Israel or the US try to displace the Gazans, they will actually directly enter into conflict with both countries. And so we're really heading, if we follow the direction and travel, and we have been saying at UK Column that this is coming, we're heading for a very dangerous precipice of regional and potentially global war.
Thank you, Vanessa. And on top of that, no, it's never too far away that the net zero CBDC technocratic policy is there as well, which is quite incredible, which brings us on to Sandi. Welcome to the program, Sandi. And we're kicking off. You were talking last week about the devolution situation in the UK with regional mayors and so on. And well, Plymouth is the latest city to declare that they would like a directly elected mayor. And they're going to be holding a referendum, apparently, but there's not universal support for it.
No, this is quite an interesting story. It's we have these two characters, two Labour MPs, Luke Pollard, from Sutton and Devonport, and Fred Thomas from Moorview. And they've slammed proposals for this the directly elected mayor to be brought into their council. Because they're saying, we don't like this level, this second layer of that they don't need, which is going to be very costly. I mean, the referendum itself is going to cost, I think it's 410,000 for the referendum, and the mayor's wages will be 80,000 per year. And they reckon the staffing cost with the wages and the office will come to 1.5 million a year. So, and of course, all the taxpayers will be footing this bill. And we can't let them off the hook, because I don't think they're being entirely honest. They're saying that this is a political move, but actually, they're never going to really tell the electorate what's really going on. But they're opposing it from a political standpoint, not really from a understanding or letting people know about the global consequences of this, which we do know, which we spoke about last week. But there are areas that have scrapped these local mayors. There's Bristol, Torbay, Stoke, Hartlepool, Liverpool, and they've abandoned these plans to take on these directly elected mayors. So there's reasons to be to be cheerful about this, in our own way, because we know where this is leading to, but. More people, hopefully, will be understanding that this is a very costly thing, and we don't really want it. Yeah, so that's quite a cheerful story, a local story, that they're actually questioning it and saying, look, we don't want this. Yeah, which is good. And also, I mean, I'm looking really at the reasons why we can have a little bit of hope, because I do see there is opposition to these plans, and looking at it globally, we've got the midway through to 2023, the Digital Compact meeting. I mean, the UN admitted that only 15% of the SDGs were on track, while 30% had actually stalled, and we've got a lot of these leaders like Klaus Schwab, really almost, sort of showing concern that they're not meeting their targets. Commitments to net zero are worth zero without the plans, policies, and actions to back it up. And we cannot afford to take movers or late movers. They're clearly worried, and there's more slide on that as well. You've got Antonio Guterres saying, if you cannot set a credible course for net zero, you should not be in business. They're worried, I think, about the businesses actually getting on board with this, because the businesses are late. The whole stakeholder capitalism thing needs businesses to get involved, and a lot of them are falling short on their net zero commitments. And then we've got we've got the online harms, stuff that they're really worried about. They're really worried about people's freedom of speech, people speaking up against any of this. The spread of hatred and lies online is causing grave harm to our world. Misinformation, disinformation, and hate speech are fueling prejudice, violence, exacerbating divisions and conflicts, demonizing minorities, and compromising the integrity of elections. Well, they've got to fight the media who are calling all of this out. So, we've got some. We realise that we're rattling their cages a bit. Now, the other thing that's happened this week is, a wonderful woman from Council Watch Eastbourne, Serena Stannard, appeared having watched UK Column last week. Have you got anything to say about that, Mike?
Yes, I mean, she decided to intervene in her local council, and we've got a little bit of video. I was just going to show the first minute or so of the video that she recorded following the council meeting, and we're going to show a little bit of the response from the council itself in extra. But let's just have a listen to what she had to say about her intervention at her local council.
Hello and welcome to Eastbourne Council Watch. Well, we're one of those councils who will be in the first tranche to experiment with Labour's devolution bill. which also means that we don't get to vote in council elections this May. So I thought I'd go along to a council meeting and make my and others' feelings known and to put it on the record, so to speak. Unfortunately, it was only a cabinet meeting, which meant that it was Lib Dems and not the Tories who were the ones to vote against the May elections. But I didn't know if I'd get another chance to speak in full council, so I went for it anyway. There was one Tory councillor in the public gallery, so maybe word will get back. And there's a possibility that I can speak in a full council meeting where they will be discussing devolution again, which will give me time to write a more considered speech. Having written yesterday's speech, I then put on UK Column to listen before I went off to the meeting, and up popped Sandi Adams with loads of information about devolution. So that was the cue for me to rush off and rewrite my speech in about half an hour. However, it got a good reception, and do listen to what the council member for Net Zero had to say.
So we'll show you what the devolution, or the Minister for the Council member for Net Zero had to say in extra. But Sandi, this I have to say is great, because this is exactly what we hope for. We hope the information that we put out on the UK Column News will be used by people who are active in some way. That's exactly the point. And so well done to Serena.
Yeah, I mean, what fantastic response from Serena. And as you say, this is what we're here for, to give information and for people to take action on that information, and wonderful news, really. And she went straight into the meeting, really, to address the assault on democracy because of the voting. But actually, because of what she saw, she then brought it really into the global arena about how this was brought down from Italy in 1992 to bring everything from Agenda 21 from global to local, which was, Italy was in every town council. So we've had all that happening, and and she did talk about how she was absolutely furious, really, about the fact that the Tory council and the Labour council colluded in order for this to happen. And she said, if this is the way politics is going, then God help us. And I tend to agree.
Yeah. Okay. Fantastic, Sandi. Thank you very much for that. Now, in the meantime, staying in the UK, Charles, what's happening with homeschooling?
Well, quite a bit, or at least so we're led to believe by the government. And in particular, we're going to look at the gathering momentum in the attack on and the stigmatisation of home education, which follows Ben's excellent report on the manipulation of children to promote artificial intelligence and the dystopian virtual existence which can come with it. Now, referred to by Mike in last Wednesday's news was the new AI playbook for the UK government. This has gone to the Department of Education, who should therefore be able to demonstrate that they know what AI is and its limitations. That comes from Principle 1. Principles 2 and 3 require the use of AI lawfully, ethically and responsibly, as well as knowing how to use AI securely. Most importantly, perhaps, educators should have meaningful human control at the right stage, prescribed by Principle 4. So for those in doubt about the Department for Education's motives, there is an ever-increasing trend in home education. And for the autumn term last year, the government believes there to be 111,700 children in what's described as elective home education. In the House of Commons at the moment, there are the Children Not in School Bill and the Children's Wellbeing and Schools Bill, both of which intend to assume control of the lives of children on a level hitherto not seen. And the mechanism for pushing this agenda has been to conflate absenteeism, criminal activity, behavioural issues, mental health concerns, and the willful abuse of children with the practice of providing education for children in the home. The Children's Wellbeing and Schools Bill, now at the committee stage, is described by Education Otherwise a home education charity, as conflating home education with safeguarding risk, despite there being no evidence that home education represents a risk to children. And in November last year, the Permanent Undersecretary at the Department for Education, Stephen Morgan, said the government will introduce compulsory children not in school registers in every local authority in England as part of the Children's Wellbeing Bill. This was in response to a question as to whether the Education Secretary will take steps to ensure that children remain in mainstream education rather than home education. Of interest is that this question came from Lee Anderson, an MP for Reform, indicating that party's views on liberty and freedom of choice. But during a debate on the register at Clause 24, Stephen Morgan doubled down and said it's necessary to have that requirement. It provides a check to ensure that home education is in the best interests of the child. But of course, what he really means is that the decision is to be taken by the state and in the interests of the state rather than the child or the child's family. And already stated within the government's guidance on elective home education, the council can make an informal inquiry to check your child is getting a suitable education at home. They can serve a school attendance order if they think your child needs to be taught at school. Now, articles such as this from the BBC create the lie that children who are not in school should be classified as home educated, hence the call for further safeguarding and control mechanisms. And to go alongside the creation of this register, the bill would introduce what's called a consistent identifier for certain children. The clause that deals with it in its current form says that the designated person considers that the inclusion of the consistent identifier is likely to facilitate the exercise by any person of a function of that person that relates to safeguarding or promoting the welfare of children. Now, if you followed that, then you'll consider that the idea of a consistent identifier, whilst it's been around for at least a decade, it's always been contested that though a digital record, it would not have any sensitive information attached to it, as it's only meant to be a mechanism by which children could be tracked through the system. But in the very unlikely event that it were to start as such, there can be very little doubt that it's the thin end of the wedge and brings about the normalisation of everyday activities being connected to a digital record, one of the purposes of digital identity, which Mike's going to cover more later in today's programme. But in this case, how many designated persons are not going to automatically insist that it's in the child's best interest to be branded in such a way in order to fulfil the so-called safeguarding element of their jobs? So this looks like a very short step towards the possibility of enforced state intervention, supposedly in the child's best interests. We also have reports such as that by the Youth Justice Board for England and Wales submitted to the Education Committee inquiry into home education, which just adds fuel to the fire. And back in November 2020, they wrote that the Youth Justice Board has real concerns regarding the suitability of home education for some children, particularly those who are at risk of entering or who are already in the justice system. And this is really a blatant attempt to stigmatise home education by describing those who are either not at school or are involved in criminal activity as home educated. And this is how it's possible to drive the legislation to counter that apparent problem. The Youth Justice Board goes on to adopt the airport security philosophy by saying that time spent out of school, for whatever reason, is recognised to constitute a significant risk to children who are vulnerable to criminal exploitation. They did, though, concede that the Department of Education does not hold any data on the educational attainment of known home educated children in England, which seems a most significant omission. And to return to the start of this report, the Youth Justice Board report destroys any credibility it may have had by considering that, quote, one of the positive outcomes of the COVID-19 lockdown has been the education system's fast-paced adoption of virtual education technology. Although this method of education is not ideal, it could show potential for the development of future alternative support packages for children by reducing the need to exclude or home educate. A rather depressing picture, yes. I think. Now, if you're undecided on this issue, I would recommend reading Richard Morrissey's most recent piece in The Conservative Woman, describing the erosion of family identity and the appalling consequences for children as a result of exactly the virtual technology which the Youth Justice Board promotes. So I think a lot to think about, a lot more to talk about in extra on that. And if you've got any thoughts specifically on...
Well, it's we've published one article by Martin Edwards already on the issue of the use of exclusion in schools and the way that children are being treated by schools in many, many ways. This is going to be followed up with 3 or 4 more articles in the coming days. And actually, there's quite a picture building here about the attack on children.
Yeah, I mean, it's very notable that, I don't want to sort of, overdo the point, but the BBC in particular, if you do search home education on the BBC, it is absolutely phenomenal, the number of different ways in which they can say that there is something wrong with everybody that is home educated, and indeed those that choose to do it for their children. Quite phenomenal propaganda.
Yes. Okay. Let's move on. If you like what the UK Column does, you'd like to support us, support.ukcolumn.org is the place to go. We do need your ongoing financial support. You can make a donation or join as a member. You'd be very welcome. And there are various membership levels there, but pick something up at the UK Column shop if you can as well, or buy something from clive2carl.com. We get a small commission on sales so long as you use the link that's on this page. But if you can't do any of that, please do share our material, because we are still, of course, subject to censorship on the various platforms, despite what you may have heard about X in particular. And so we do have links there for you to help with that. Another reminder of Saturday, the 5th of April, 2025 in Cheltenham. Please do join us for that. Tickets going very fast. And we are looking forward to seeing everybody at it. Tomorrow at 1 p.m., Brian will be speaking this is part 2 of 2 entitled "Child Stealing by the State: A Mother Criminalised for Speaking Out." Now, this interview is part of a series, which is going to be, there are going to be many more of these over the next period, which cover template cases of child snatching by the state, also where the children are abused in the care of social services. I think that point that Brian would be very keen to make here is that mothers and fathers are trusting the UK Column to bring forward their cases and their evidence. But we do want to make it clear to everybody contacting the UK Column, we are a small team. We often can't respond or react immediately, but we're dedicated to exposing this state-sponsored crime, and we're fighting hard for the parents suffering within that abusive system. And so just stick with us. We are going to get these stories out. Now, yesterday, Ben was speaking to Rosie Marshall on her efforts to bring and highlight the situation of people damaged by COVID vaccines in Australia. If you haven't seen that, it's on the website now. Please do go have a look at it. Another reminder of Public Child Protection Wales conference taking place on the 22nd of February. Lots of great speakers at that. Support Kim Esherwood if you possibly can. And also that's if you're in Wales, of course, or close to Wales. If you're in Scotland or close to, you can head up to Edinburgh for the Scottish People's COVID-19 inquiry. That's taking place also on Saturday the 22nd. I'd get along to that if you possibly can. And one more ad here.
Yes, Sunday the 16th of March, just outside Cheltenham, Farmers Force Security Symposium. So really getting to the heart of how to address your own personal situation and how to develop relationships with farmers and deal with the very real issue of food security in a way that the government is completely unable to. And that will involve a great range of speakers, some of whom the UK Column audience will be familiar with, including Sandi, and I will be comparing the event. So get your tickets now.
Fantastic. Okay, thank you. Now let's welcome Vanessa back. And Vanessa, what's going on in your neck of the woods in Lebanon at the moment? Actually, Vanessa's not there. Are you there?
I am here.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. Right. So let's go with Lebanon.
Yes. First of all, I just wanted to remind people this is the U.S. Embassy in Lebanon. Something I can't remember how many football pitches it is, but it's vast. It's a garrison, 5,000 employees. The only bigger one is in Iraq, which of course has been colonized by the US for more than 30 years. It's a military center headquarters on one of the highest hills above the city of Beirut. So just to put everything into context about what I'm going to be talking about. And of course, yesterday was the end of the ceasefire. And although Israel has withdrawn from the majority of the areas in the south, of course, they've continued both to violate before and after the actual withdrawal. And they maintain their occupation in 5 key areas, which we've been talking about, which are the 5 main hills. If you just move on to the actual map, the little red triangles are quite small, but you can freeze the screen and then be able to see them. But all the areas in red are basically the high points and strategic points in southern Lebanon, where Israel has not only maintained a presence, but is now, of course, building a military footprint, and that is ongoing. Now, what has also been extraordinary, we're heading towards the funeral of the assassinated Syed Hassan Nasrallah, the Secretary General of Hezbollah, who was killed in an appalling way, using about 80 bombs to target his area, of course, killing multiple civilians during the attack, and potentially having used a tactical nuke, because depleted uranium has been identified in the area where Syed Nasrallah was killed. So bearing in mind, we're heading on the 23rd for this funeral. 1.5 million to 2 million people are expected to attend the funeral. Guess what? The Israel suddenly tells the US that they must block an Iranian flight returning from Tehran to Beirut after Israel claimed that the IRGC was smuggling cash on civilian planes. So we have a very familiar story here. And in fact, it was Lebanese civilians who were turned back and had to return to Tehran after a spiritual visit to Tehran. And of course, what happened then, there were mass protests, and these protests were not only from Hezbollah, they were from Lebanese civilians who said, we're not going to be dictated to who can land at our airport by Israel and the United States. This is a sovereign country. And here you have a protester at the International Airport Road holds up a sign saying the road towards the airport is not Israeli. And eventually what happened is the Lebanese army fired on the protesters, both using live ammunition and tear gas. And of course, that infuriated people even more, because for how long the Lebanese army has been allowing the Israelis to target Lebanese civilians in the south and has not intervened at all. And case in question is 13-year-old Khadija Atwi. Here she is with the photo of her father, who was martyred in the last war. She's 13 years old. She was hit by an Israeli sniper in her cheek in Hula, one of the villages close to the borderline with the occupied Palestinian territories. And as her sister said in a report to Al Mayadeen, if we can just have the next slide, please. On February the 16th, Israel occupation forces opened fire on and killed 13-year-old Khadija Atwi in Hula. But what they don't mention is that they left her to bleed out. Moments before her murder, she told her sister, I miss my dad and want to visit his grave. A minute later, a bullet struck her cheek, an injury her sister says shouldn't have been fatal. In an interview with Mayadeen, one of her sisters revealed that the Israeli occupation forces arrived in civilian jeeps in an obvious attempt at deceiving Hula's residents before opening fire at them. Her sisters also denounced the Lebanese government's failure to act swiftly, saying that if the Lebanese army had received orders to, just like the ones they were given on the airport road, if they had fired tear gas at the Israeli enemy, they could have saved the child who died, as I said, from basically bleeding out. And then again, it was exposed this week by Dr. Elias Jaradar, who's one of the ophthalmologists dealing with the hideous pager attacks that blinded and maimed multiple civilians in southern Lebanon last year. The US sanctions at that time were imposed deliberately to ban the import of corneas needed for eye surgeries. So the actual suffering, if you remember, they cancelled flights, evacuating people outside of Lebanon for treatment. And To add to the injury, now Air France and Emirates have suspended their flights to Beirut on February the 23rd. So this can only be seen as a vindictive campaign to prevent people being able to peacefully honour the loss of one of the most important figures in Lebanon.
Thank you for that, Vanessa. Thank you. We'll talk more about that in extra, I'm quite sure. Charles, let's come back to the UK then, and what's going on with farming?
Well, it's never really enough time to cover all of it, but we look to the BBC, as is often the case, and as referenced last week, the state's scaremongers-in-chief, the previously referenced BBC, were promoting alleged calls for a vaccine with which to prevent the spread of so-called avian flu. But of course, this is a false choice. Firstly, because there's no substantial evidence for the existence of avian flu, and even less suggests that wild birds can make domesticated birds ill. But secondly, the only thing killing birds in large numbers is the government, which has dusted off its slaughter on suspicion policy and uplifted its capability for the destruction of perfectly healthy birds. And as reported on by UK Culling, the government has pushed all keepers of birds to register them with the government, the only possible consequence of which is to harm the birds, either via degrading their environment through keeping them indoors or by slaughtering them in order that they do not contract a non-existent illness. So the stench of carcasses is really only eclipsed by that of the corruption of government, industry, and, of course, philanthropy. Just to walk you through it, Section 5 of the Avian Influenza Regulations 2006 prohibits vaccination in birds. Therefore, it will come as no surprise to learn that Section 6 of the same regulations permits vaccination under emergency conditions. The United States has invoked its own protocols in the past few days and granted a conditional license to Zoetis for the use of its avian influenza vaccine. Zoetis is a former subsidiary of Pfizer, and it explains that a conditional license is used to meet an emergency condition, a limited market, local situation, or other special circumstance, and is issued for a finite period of time. Use of such a vaccine in the UK was being promoted by somebody called Professor Ian Brown of the Animal and Plant Health Agency exactly 2 years ago, despite the standing regulations prohibiting such a development. He is also a director of the UN's Food and Agriculture Programme, which, like so many UN initiatives, receives regular funding from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Zoetis, being, as I say, a former subsidiary of Pfizer, also receives funding from the Gates Foundation, most recently to advance sustainable livestock production. Now, in all of this, a significant document to which much corruption can be traced back to was produced by the World Bank in 2010 called People, Pathogens and Our Planet. I would say that this treatise on fear and fiction asserts that pandemics will occur with alarming regularity and that a majority will be zoonotic in origin, though it's not clear exactly how they were able to predict this with such certainty. But there's no doubt that this entire document is doublespeak for the many ways in which the rural environment and its people and animals should be attacked. And it should be noted that it traces the origins of the One Health doctrine back to the supposed outbreak of avian influenza in 2003. The foreword of this document includes the proposition that the risks that zoonotic diseases represent to public health has led to appeals for more horizontal interaction among the disciplines and the sector agencies, departments and ministries that are responsible for public health, medical professions, veterinary services and the environment, which roughly translates as kill all their animals and take all their land. I should remind you that, according to their own statistics, the government have conducted the mass slaughter in this country of millions of birds and put many farmers out of businesses, people out of jobs, on the basis of recording just 38 cases of so-called avian influenza across the whole of the United Kingdom since the 24th of November last year. On a related note, but not so closely related as you might imagine, The Sun reports that the pub chain Wetherspoons has removed eggs from its menus due to a shortage. Now, it's likely that this will be believed to be a consequence of what the government is calling avian influenza, but as always, there are several factors at play, and the capital to be extracted from a shortage, as in convincing the public that biosecurity is everybody's responsibility, a mantra developed by the chief vet, Christine Middlemiss, while she worked in New South Wales, Australia, prior to her current job. But in fact, it's the push for improvements to animal welfare in the main, which have set the conditions for any perceived shortage. In moving from caged to free-range birds, a target for this year, there are comparatively fewer barn eggs, and keeping poultry indoors in extremely cramped conditions on top of their own feces is really what makes birds ill. Something which is then ascribed to avian influenza because a PCR test finds the one thing it's been asked to look for. The Grocer magazine reports that the cost of free-range eggs has increased more than 20% since the start of this year, and their report on the egg market from last month described that increased production costs of over 70% in certain quarters. So, as well as price increases in free-range eggs, which are no longer free-range, of course, because all these birds are now to be kept indoors due to biosecurity diktats, but can still be labelled as free range, there is a relative scarcity of barn eggs. Now, perversely or intentionally, the pursuit of welfare has also seen a reduction in the production of organic eggs by 16%, which looks bad for birds and bad for you. And we now move on to shotguns, and we look at the BASC staying on the omnipresent theme of state overreach, the introduction of new police powers to enter the homes of holders of firearms, the affront to liberty and the gratuitous application of unwarranted enforcement is well described by Bill Harriman, the Director of Firearms at the British Association for Shooting and Conservation, and he says, quote, that this fundamentally undermines the principles of fairness and due process. The government is handing the police sweeping powers to enter the homes of certificate holders when the ability to do so to protect public safety is already enshrined in law. This is potentially a serious infringement on the human rights of firearms users. In addition, by removing the safeguard of judicial oversight, a law-abiding section of society has been placed firmly into the category of second-class citizens, an article that will be in the show notes and is worth reading. So regardless of your views on the ownership and use of firearms and shotguns, I think the point to draw out here is that, like an ever-increasing amount of new legislation and regulatory powers, this goes well beyond the point of justification by public safety. And finally, when reporting on the adjournment of the Climate and Nature Bill until the 11th of July, I suggested that it could be in part related to the end of the summer term for schools. So it's interesting to see now that the Department for Education is blogging about the push for climate education, which came immediately after the vote in January, and also that the National Education Union are expressing their bitter disappointment at what happened to the bill. And they say that the findings show that young people who stand to lose the most, living on a degraded planet, are not receiving the necessary teaching and learning about the scale, scope, and likely development of climate breakdown because whole school learning on climate isn't embedded into all areas of the curriculum. Stand by if you have children in formal state education.
Indeed. And let's end with digital ID. So the digital ID policy is, the policy agenda is moving ahead. Following the establishment, as we reported on some time ago, of the Office for Digital Identities and Attributes, well, the British regime is working on introducing a digital voter authority certificate and using digital versions of identification documents stored in the gov.uk wallet that we're all going to have at polling stations as part of its review of voter ID policy. This was announced in response to the Electoral Commission's report on the 2024 elections published last week. I'll just quote from this. It says, we are exploring digital versions of identification documents in general as part of our review of the voter ID policy, and will alongside this consider the possibility of introducing digital voter authority certificates. Digital IDs, they say, are becoming increasingly common, and a digital voter authority certificate could provide benefits, particularly in terms of convenience for the elector. So there you go. That's what's going to bring it in, is convenience. Now, in the meantime, Politics Home is reporting that a group of mainly of the 2024 batch of MPs are demanding digital ID to stave off the Reform Party, because apparently MPs see digital ID as driving public services. This is a quote, driving public services, cutting spending, reducing welfare fraud, improving law enforcement and controlling borders. And they see this as being a pushback against Farage and reform. But they also seem to be suggesting that digital ID would enable the benefits system to move to a so-called contributory model where benefits are paid in. Where benefits that are paid back to the person are based on what's already been paid in the system, similar to what's going on in Denmark. So the question is, will the British people go for all this? The answer is possibly yes, although since the survey here on screen was carried out by Thales, who are selling their own mobile ID smart app, I think we need to take this with a fairly huge pinch of salt. Anyway, Thales are claiming that in their survey that of 1,000 people, so not a huge number, that a third have a store of documents such as passports and driving licenses held on their mobile devices in an insecure way at the moment. And so they are also suggesting that perhaps unsurprisingly younger people are more likely to do this. Now, finally, on this issue for today, the UK regime has, you'll be pleased to know, signed a memorandum of understanding with Anthropic. This is a US-based company which describes itself as an AI safety and research company. The UK government clearly think they need to provide cover for what they're doing with digital ID and AI. And make no mistake, there are two sides. These are two sides of the same coin. So remember, anyone in this country or everyone in this country is going to be genomically sequenced as part of the recently announced plans for AI in this country. And that only works if genomic sequences are linked to digital ID. So it's interesting that they're trying to bring in this company from the United States to persuade us all that it's all perfectly all right and all perfectly safe. We'll talk about this more in extra, I'm sure, but we've got to leave the news for today. I'm going to say thank you very much to Vanessa, Sandi and Charles for today's news. So thank you all for watching. Stick around on the stream if you are a UK Culling member. Otherwise, don't forget the interview, Brian's interview tomorrow at 1 p.m. But we'll see you again on Friday at 1 for another news program. See you then. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.